how it has been organized. In the state level, we have 6 subcommittees. It is functioning under six verticals. So one is the science communication, in which we are doing. So we do the science communication. The second one is the science publications. Now we are publishing a couple of magazines, Tolir and Jantar Mantar. That's coming on monthly. Tolir is Tamil magazine, Jantar Mantar is in English. That's meant for college level students. Tolir is meant for the school level students. And apart from that, we have some more magazines which is meant for the TNSF members. If you are a member, you will get a magazine called Virudu. The Siragu, sorry, Siragu. The Siragu will be dispatched to you every month, explaining the activities of TNSF. And we have another magazine called Virudu. Then also publish a lot of books in Tamil. We have a science publication section. So this is activities of the publication. And the third one is the Samam, which is meant for roping the women in science. So we provide, we want to, science has to, more women should get involved in science. We are exclusively focusing on that. For that, we have a separate wing called Samam, which is focusing on that. And fourth is we do a lot of work on environment and development. So both combined together, because we need development. Simultaneously, we should also protect our environment. So both cannot be separated. We have a separate wing which is working on that. And another one is the health and education. So we focus on education, we focus on health as well. And finally, we have science for youth. So this is 5 different verticals we are working. I would like to make an appeal through this forum that be a member of Tamil Nadu Science Forum. It's a very easy process. We have placed a QR code. Just scan the QR code, fill up the form, submit. You become a member. It's a monthly, yearly fees is 30 rupees. You can do it through the GPay. We provide the GPay number as well. Then put the transaction ID, finish. You become a member. This popular science lecture group is having a lot of social media group. One is the Google group. You become a Google group member. It is a 6,500 song membership we have for the popular science Google group. We have a Telegram group. It is 1,500 membership. And we have WhatsApp group. All of them, you can get into that through a simple scan in the QR code, which has been placed here. So with this, let me hand over to Joseph Prabhu, who will introduce the speaker. Once then the speaker will take up.
Morning to all. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Menon is an associate professor with the philosophy group at the School of Arts and Sciences in Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. He studied physics at Amherst College and philosophy at the University of California, San Diego. He specializes in the philosophy of science, its intersections with political and social philosophy. His published research includes work on the nature of evidence and explanation in the natural sciences, the role of moral and social values in scientific research, and the conceptions of justice that should guide climate policy. He also works on the structure of systems of social power and has recently co-edited a volume of essays entitled Cultural Domination, Philosophical Perspectives. With this short introduction, I would like to speak.
I think this is better. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending, and thanks to the Tamil Nadu Science Forum for inviting me. Just to get into my talk, the talk is provocatively titled. It suggests maybe a kind of anti-intellectualism, the idea that the less you know, the better. Hopefully, as the talk proceeds, the sense in which I mean this will become clear. I mean, I don't mean this as an all-encompassing claim that we should try to understand or know as less than we actually do, but there's a sense in which the fact that our perspective on the world is incomplete, the fact that there's a certain amount of information about the world that we cannot access, the fact that our view of the world is, in a sense, a little blurry, that actually contributes to our understanding of the world around us. And hopefully the talk will make clear why I think this is so, why, in some sense, being able to avoid or not access certain information actually gives us greater access to some parts of the world. Um, Let me begin by introducing kind of mathematical toy that some of you might be familiar with. This was developed by the mathematician John Conway, who's on the screen here. And this was something he called the game of life. It's kind of a simple mathematical model. Um, and you can see kind of the basic idea here on the right-hand side. Conway imagined this grid, which you can imagine just extending in all directions. And each cell of the grid, each square in the grid, can either be alive or dead. If it's alive, it's colored black. If it's dead, it has nothing in it. It's empty. It's colored white, right? And Conway came up with a set of very simple rules for how this grid will evolve over time. So based on its current configuration, based on which cells are currently alive, which cells will be alive in the next moment, and the moment after that, and so on. Yeah. So here are the rules. They're very simple rules. So one rule is that if you have a cell that is fairly lonely, it only has one neighbor, let's say. In fact, less than two neighbors. So if it has only one neighbor, then in the next generation, it will die. It will no longer be alive. If you have a cell that has exactly two neighbors, then it will stay alive. Two or three neighbors, it will stay alive. If it has more than three neighbors, then it dies from overpopulation, I guess. So this cell has four neighbors, it dies in the next step. And finally, if you have an empty cell that has three neighbors, that empty cell will become alive in the next moment, right? These are the rules for how this grid evolves over time. Each cell in this grid evolves in this way. Now, the point of this example is that these are extremely simple rules, right? There's these four rules, they're extremely simple rules. But the reason that the game of life, as Conway called it, has captured people's interest is that it turns out that these simple rules can produce extraordinarily complex behavior, right? Here is, for example, one illustration of a pattern in the game of life. Everything that's happening here is just following the rules that I just described, right? Now, what I would like you to notice here is, well, of course, you have complex behavior going on, but also after you've watched this for maybe a second or two, you should be able to predict how it's going to work in the future, right? You get a sense that, okay, there is this large thing that's moving to the right, it's leaving behind some kind of trail, so you should be able to predict how things are going to proceed in the future. And the point is, you're not predicting this by calculating exactly how Conway's rules are going to lead to the next stage at the next stage. You can just see the pattern at a kind of higher level, and you understand how that pattern will probably work in the future. Yeah. And this kind of idea of like complex behavior, which you can kind of understand and predict without having to know the basic rules or calculate using the basic rules. This is a fairly common feature of patterns in the game of life. In fact, here is another pattern. Let me just play this. What is happening here is, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but really if you pay attention to what's happening on the bottom right, is that this is just calculating prime numbers. So it's keeping all the dots that correspond to prime numbers and it's getting rid of the ones that don't. And this will keep going on forever. It calculates all the prime numbers. So again, starting from these very simple rules, those four very simple rules, you have quite a complex calculation, calculating all the prime numbers in a sequence. And in fact, it's been proven that any computational process that can be done in the game of life. The game of life is what is called Turing complete, which means that any computer program that you can run on a computer, you can simulate it in the game of life. Of course, it will become increasingly complex how many cells you need, but in principle, you can do that here. So what is the point here? Well, this is, to a lot of people, this seems extraordinary that you have these extremely simple four rules that could produce this highly complex set of behavior in this grid-like system. But of course, in some sense, this is something that we should all be familiar with, right? Because this is how the world around us works. Of course, the world around us is not a grid that updates stage by stage in the way the game of life works. But the basic idea that we get from science in some sense is that there are simple rules, and here is an attempt to encapsulate those simple rules in a single equation. This is from the physicist Sean Carroll. There are simple rules that might not look very simple, but it's expressible on one screen. that govern the behavior of everything we see around us at some level. Right? All of this is generated by the operation of the simple rule in the same way that those 4 simple rules of the games of life generated all of that complex behavior, can generate any computation. In the same way, this relatively simple rule generates all of this behavior, right? In principle, at least, everything we see around us, the behavior of predators and prey, the behavior of nebulae, the behavior of our human brain, all of this, if you ultimately think of it in terms of physical systems undergoing certain changes, which is ultimately what they are, it's all a product of that simple rule. And to a lot of scientists and philosophers, this has indicated a certain way of thinking about the world, which is often called reductionism. The idea that ultimately everything that's important explanatorily about the world comes from our understanding of the behavior of its basic constituents. Once we understand how matter behaves, in principle, we have an understanding of how everything behaves. Right? And this is a startling view, but it's a view that's been expressed by a number of eminent scientists. Here, for example, is the scientist Steven Weinberg, a Nobel-winning physicist, who says all the explanatory arrows point downwards, from societies to people to organs to cells to biochemistry to chemistry and ultimately to physics. What is he saying here? He's saying that society, social behavior, patterns of social behavior ultimately are explained in terms of physics, right? Because society is made up of people, people are made up of organs, organs are made up of cells, cells are made up of molecules, and so on, down to the fundamental physical constituents. And we have simple rules that tell us how those fundamental physical constituents work. So in principle, those simple rules govern how our society functions. This is Weinberg's argument, right? Here is a biologist, Francis Crick, again, one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, making a similar argument. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Right here, he's not carrying the reduction down to the level of physics, but he's, in principle, why stop at nerve cells and molecules? You can say, well, those are made out of atoms that behave according to the rules of physics. So it's ultimately, if we follow Crick's reasoning, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, ambitions, and so on, are a product or are in fact no more, according to him, than the behavior of fundamental physical particles, atoms, and so on. So this is kind of this reductionist worldview. And actually, the attraction of this worldview, even though on the one hand, it seems to be a ridiculous worldview, right? We look around us, we look at all this complexity, we look at the exercise of will that's involved in our interactions with each other, in social behavior. And it seems a ridiculous claim to say that this ultimately reduces down to physics or the behavior of, or just physical law. And yet, the argument made by these scientists is that, well, what else is there? I mean, ultimately, isn't everything made up of these particles, and we understand how those particles work? And if we understand how those particles work, then what else is there? There's nothing more going on. This is what Crick is claiming, and Weinberg was claiming as well. And there is a history to this kind of view. And perhaps the most famous, influential expression of this reductionist view comes from about a century and a half, or almost a couple of centuries ago, from the physicist Laplace, the mathematician Laplace. Right? Laplace famously suggested this thought experiment where he said, imagine there was some mind that was capable of understanding the positions of all the particles in the universe and understanding the laws that govern all those particles. And he says this. He says, an intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom, for such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, could be present before its eyes. This intellect that Laplace is referring to has since come to be called Laplace's demon, although Laplace doesn't call it a demon specifically in his writing. But the idea here is that Laplace was writing at a time when the dominant framework in physics was Newton's framework, Newton's laws. And what he appreciated about those laws was that Newton's laws tell us exactly how particles will behave in the future and in the past. So if we know, if there was this powerful intellect that could know the arrangement of particles at this moment, nothing would be hidden from it. It would know everything about what will happen in the future, what will happen in the past. And this, again, is a powerful expression of this kind of reductionist worldview. And what I want to argue in today's talk is that this worldview is mistaken, that there is, in fact, it's not just that, there's more to know than just what you can know by knowing the fundamental structure of the universe. But in fact, Laplace's demon, by having this kind of access to the world that Laplace describes, is closed off from understanding certain aspects of the world. There's certain aspects of the world you can understand only if you do not have the kind of all-encompassing knowledge that Laplace's demon is supposed to have, which is a good thing for us because none of us are Laplace's demon. Right? So that's the argument I'm going to try to present today in response to these reductionist viewpoints. Okay. Now, one argument someone might make against reductionist is to say that, look, reductionism of the kind we've just talked about is fine in theory, but in reality, we can't do biology or psychology or economics by just reducing everything to physics because it is computationally intractable. We simply cannot compute physics well enough. We don't have the computational power to be able to start from physics and derive facts about biology or about economics and so on. So it's just a matter of not having enough computational power. If we were Laplace's demon, if we did have that all-encompassing intellect that he talks about, maybe then this would be a fine way to go about thinking about the world, that everything is explained by physics. But we are not. We are limited creatures. And because of our limitations, we have to understand the world around us, the macroscopic world as opposed to the microscopic world. We have to understand it independently of fundamental physics. We have to understand it using other theories like biology, like economics, like psychology, and so on. Yeah. But this view still concedes that in some sense, the ideal position to be in would be one where we didn't have this limitation, right? So this view sees our lack of knowledge as a limitation we possess. And because we possess that limitation, we need more than just physics. But again, what I want to argue is that this view is not really correct either, that it's not simply a limitation that we don't know about the world, but it's a resource, that there are aspects of the world that are revealed to us through that lack of knowledge. So let me give you a simple example to illustrate how that might be the case, and then we'll talk more about actual scientific examples. So one thing to say, so let me begin by saying that the Laplacian view and also the view I just described, the view that it's a limitation on our knowledge that prevents us from doing this derivation, it's based on the very intuitive and basic idea, which is that the less information you have about anything, the less you know about it, the less you are able to describe it, understand it, and so on, right? So, and you understand having less information in terms of, in some sense, metaphorically, having a kind of blurry view of the thing, right? So on the left-hand side of this, well, my right-hand side, but your left-hand side of this image, you have the same image but blurred. And when you unblur the image, you're able to see it in much more detail. What happens when you're blurring an image in this way is that you are losing information. You are dropping certain information out. And dropping that information or losing that information necessarily means that you don't know as much about the image or the system that you're studying. Right? That's a very intuitive idea. Here's another place where that idea is used. This is something that some of you might have seen. This is a test that is used for color blindness. Yeah, it's called the Ishihara test for color blindness. And the idea here is that if you are not colorblind, if you're not red-green colorblind, you should be able to see a number in the center of this image. And the reason that people who are not colorblind can see the number, but people who are colorblind cannot, is that people who are not colorblind are able to see more of the detail in this image. They're able to make distinctions that a colorblind person would not be able to make. In some sense, they're seeing a less blurry version of this image. I'm using the word blurry metaphorically here because being colorblind is not seeing things as blurred, but it is seeing less information in the image than someone who is not colorblind. Being able to make less distinctions, fewer distinctions than someone who is not colorblind would be able to make. And so this kind of illustrates how certain features of the world are only available to people who have a certain ability to make distinctions, to see information in the system. And again, this goes along with the view I was talking about earlier, that the more we know about a system, the more we are able to understand its features, understand what's going on with it. Here is maybe an exception. So this is also a test for colorblindness, but this is actually a reverse colorblindness test. Right? In this image, if you are red-green colorblind, especially severely red-green colorblind, you should easily be able to see a pattern. If you are not, then you won't be able to see it, or it will be difficult for you to see it. The pattern is, because I'm assuming since colorblindness is rare, many of you might not be colorblind, that the word life is written on this in this image. Right? But if you're not colorblind, you're not going to see it. Right? So, and the reason is that the distinctions here, if you're not colorblind, you are seeing all the distinctions you can in the image, and those distinctions are functioning as noise that is swamping the signal, that the information that is being given by the system. Right? Colorblind people filter out the noise naturally because they're not seeing distinctions between colors, and they're able to see the image. Right? They're able to see the word life.
So colorblind people can see.
Yes. Yeah, life. So colorblind people can see it. People who are not colorblind cannot see it. So this is actually a case that's the opposite of what we're just talking about, where certain salient, important aspects of the structure of the system, the image in this case, are only available to you if you ignore certain information about the system. Ignore it naturally because your visual system doesn't allow you to process it. Right? And so the simple idea that salient features of the system are more noticeable if you're able to make more distinctions is not in general true. Right? Here we have a clear counterexample of a system where actually lacking information, lacking a particular kind of information, the distinction between red and green, actually allows you to see structure that most of us would not be able to see. And this hopefully is an indication of what I mean when I say that sometimes knowing less about a system, being able to selectively ignore features of the system, highlights aspects of the structure of the system that would not be available if you were seeing the system in full detail. If you were seeing an unblurred version of the image, you would be swamped by so much information that you might miss out on salient features of that information. Yeah. So there is a word for this, what I've been calling blurring your view of things. It's something we might call coarse-graining. Right? So here you have two images. This is already a coarse-grained image of the original Mona Lisa, but this is an even more coarse-grained image. What it means to coarse-grain something, whether it's an image, any kind of system, is to selectively ignore certain information about it. Right? And essentially, when I go from this system to this, there's a certain amount of detail that is being left out, right, to move from one image to the other. And one important thing to understand about coarse graining is that when I coarse grain a system, because I'm ignoring some information about the original system, this coarse grained image can't distinguish between this image and an image that is very close to it. Maybe we might have a different image that is very close to this original one. If you had a full fine-grained image, you would be able to tell the difference. Maybe there's a slight difference in the direction in which the eyes are pointing or something. But when you coarse grain it, you lose that information. Right? So coarse graining essentially takes you from a description of a single system or a single image to something that is compatible with multiple different systems or multiple different images. This picture could be fine-grained into this, but also maybe fine-grained into something that looks a little bit like this, but is slightly different. Right? Because you are throwing away information, it's not clear what information you add back in to get back the original system. Right? So that is the idea of coarse graining. Okay, so now that I've presented this kind of intuitive sense of what it might mean to say that ignoring information about a system can actually get you more access, more understanding to that system, let's talk about whether that happens in actual science and in the real world. Um, so what I'm going to talk about now is 4 ways in which I think that having a coarse-grained view of the world actually gives you a certain kind of access to the world that we would not have if you had a fine-grained view. So let me talk about those four ways. Here's one. So remember Laplace's demon. Laplace claimed that if we knew everything about the state of the world, we would know everything that happens in the future. If we knew everything in this world right now, and if we had kind of unlimited ability to compute things, we would be able to know exactly what happens in the future. This claim is actually untrue, right? I mean, Laplace was making a mistake here. Can't blame him for it because the mathematics underlying his mistake were not discovered at the time he mentioned this. But the point is, there are certain systems that are what is called undecidable. What it means for a system to be undecidable is that even if you know all the details of the system, there is no shortcut to predicting the state it will be at a later time. Right? So if any of you have done physics, even at a high school level, you might know that a lot of what people do there is you will describe the state of a system now and ask, okay, after 10 seconds, what will this system look like? And those problems are usually simple enough that you can just plug in a formula and figure that out. But in general, when you're dealing with a complex system with many parts that are interacting, it might not be possible at all to have a shortcut that tells us, okay, what is going to happen 10 seconds from now. The only way to know that is to actually watch the system and see what happens 10 seconds later. You can't calculate immediately as a shortcut. That is what it means for a system to be undecidable. Essentially, there's no computational process at all that allows you to predict the future state of the system. So what this means is that if there are undecidable systems in the world, and there are, in fact, many such systems that are decidable, then Laplace is simply wrong, that simply knowing the full details of what is happening at a particular time is not going to help you predict, or is not going to let you know everything about the future the way he said the demon would know, if the actual world you're dealing with is undecidable. And we have plenty of evidence that tells us that the world we are dealing with, most of the systems around us, are in fact undecidable. Right? Now, why is this relevant to the idea of coarse-graining? So when you have an undecidable system, knowing its state at one moment of time does not allow you to predict its state at a later moment of time. That's simply closed off to you. No matter how powerful your brain is, no matter how powerful a computer you use, it is just simply impossible for you to predict what will happen at a later moment of time. But one thing that people have noticed, and this is an image from a paper by Israeli and Goldenfeld, and they have noticed this, and there's also other results showing this, which is that for certain systems, if you coarse-grain the system correctly, it can go from being undecidable to decidable. Right? If you drop out certain information about the system, you still have some idea of some salient structure in the system, and now you can predict at a coarse-grained level what will happen at a later time. You have a shortcut to predicting the coarse-grained behavior of the system. Right? Israeli and Goldenfeld did this with systems called cellular automata, which are very similar to the kind of game of life that I was talking about earlier, systems that follow very simple rules. Here, the system is evolving downwards. This is the initial state, the next state is here, and so on. There's some rule telling us how it evolves. This system on the right-hand side is undecidable. There's no shortcut that tells you, okay, if I know the state at the first moment, what is the state going to be at the 60th moment? But in this case, if you coarse-grain the system, take a slightly blurry view on it, drop out some of the detail, you in fact do get a predictable structure.
You change the rules of.
You do change the rules, yeah. So once you're coarse-graining, the rules governing the system also change. The rules governing the coarse-grained evolution of the system rather than the fine-grained evolution. There might be multiple different specific fine-grained evolutions that are compatible with that coarse-grained evolution. Yeah. And so here is one thing that coarse-graining can do for you, right? It can make the world predictable. Right. Laplace was mistaken to think that just knowing the state of the world and all the laws and having unlimited computational power would allow you to predict the future state of the world. That's not true as a matter of mathematical necessity. But in many cases, not knowing the full state of the world, only having a coarse-grained perspective on the world, does allow you to do that. Right? So that is one sense in which lacking certain knowledge, having a blurrier view of the world actually gives you the ability to predict the behavior of systems that you might otherwise not have. So that is first of the four reasons why, in a sense, knowing less can be better. Right? Enhanced ability, it gives you an enhanced ability to predict the future states of certain systems, because often prediction is possible at a coarse-grained level, but not at a fine-grained level. Okay, here's another point to make. So when we think about how we understand physical systems at the most fine-grained level, right? Each physical system is different from every other, even if you change the position of a single atom, let's say, right? That's a different fine-grained description of this, that's a different system you're talking about. Now, let's imagine that I was thinking about the possible states of a glass of water. Right? You have a glass of water, the atoms in that glass of water can be rearranged in a huge number of different ways. Right? All of those are possible different states that that glass of water can be in. And from a fine-grained perspective, all of those are different. From a coarse-grained perspective, which we inhabit, they're not different, right? If someone gave me a glass of water, then I turned around and they moved two atoms to different places. I turn back around, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference, right? Because I only have coarse-grained access to that glass of water. I don't have fine-grained access. So what difference does that make? Well, what I've tried to represent here very roughly is what in physics you call the state space of the system. What that means is that every point in this box, let's say, corresponds to a different possible arrangement of the atoms in that glass of water, right? So from a fine-grained perspective, all of these are different. Yeah, and here are two possible ways the glass of water might change, right? It might start out in this arrangement, and as time goes by, its state might change until it gets to this position. Or it might start out in this arrangement, and as time goes by, it follows this. From the fine-grained perspective, these are both completely different trajectories for the water to take. But of course, when we are actually observing a glass of water, we don't see its fine-grained state. We instead see a coarse-grained state. Everything within this region, for example, the pink region, might look exactly the same to us. So we can't distinguish if the glass of water state is this or this or this. This is what I meant when I said changing around the positions of a few atoms is still going to look the same to us. Yeah. So from the perspective of our view on a glass of water, we don't see its complete atomic construction. All we know is that its state is somewhere in this blob, right? And after things change a little bit, its state is somewhere in this larger blob. We can't tell the difference between all the states here. Right? So one thing to notice is that if I had complete fine-grained access to the glass of water, if I was Laplace's demon, this trajectory and this trajectory of the water would be completely different trajectories, according to me. These are two completely different things. When I'm not Laplace's demon, when I'm a regular human being like all of us, these actually look exactly the same. Why? Because I can't tell the difference between the starting points. I can't tell the difference between the ending points. And even though they're different trajectories, because I have a coarse-grained view of the system, all of these points look the same to me. All of these points look the same to me. So why is this useful? Why is not being able to tell the difference between trajectories useful? Well, it turns out a lot of our understanding of how things like glasses of water and many other regular sized physical objects behave is based on the fact that we only have this coarse-grained perspective. For example, there's a pattern that we all know that if you just put ice out in a glass of water, in a glass, eventually that ice will melt. We know this, we can make this prediction without knowing the exact atomic configuration of ice. We just see the ice and we know a little bit later it's going to melt. We don't need to know where the original ice originated. So this whole blob might correspond to the ice. We don't need to know where it originated in order to predict where it's going. We're able to make these predictions based just on the large-scale structure of the system. This is a general pattern we notice, and it's a pattern we notice because we have a coarse-grained access to the system. If it was fine-grained, I wouldn't group all these together as ice. I wouldn't group all these together as water. Each one of those states would be different. There would be no general pattern that whenever I have ice, it melts into water. This pattern, for those of you who have studied physics or chemistry, is, of course, the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is something that only works when you have coarse-grained access to the world. But this is just one example. The idea is that there's certain patterns in nature, certain regularities that are not available to us at the fine-grained level. If we describe everything at the atomic fine-grained level, those patterns are not noticeable. It's only when we group whole chunks of states together, take a coarse-grained view on the system, that we start seeing those patterns. So this is another reason why knowing less can be better, right? It allows you to see patterns that are invisible from the fine-grained perspective. Another related insight. There is a tool, a mathematical tool in physics that is used in certain areas of physics, called the renormalization group. I won't go into great detail about how it works, but I'm hoping to give you a general idea. So here's the idea of a renormalization group. The renormalization group says that sometimes you have two systems that might look very different from each other. But if you coarse grain them, right, if you ignore certain details, they start looking the same. Right? Like I said, you could have two paintings, that one of which is the Mona Lisa, one of which is like the Mona Lisa, but maybe slightly different. If you pixelate enough, they're both going to look identical. Right? That's what happens when you drop information. The things that are different from the fine-grained perspective look the same when they're coarse-grained. The renormalization group is a tool that tells you, okay, start out with systems that are very different from each other, and then start coarse-graining them. As you start coarse-graining them, the system changes, right? Because you get a blurrier and blurrier view of it. The way you think about the system changes, the way it works, the rules that govern it change. And what ends up happening for certain systems is that as they change, they start moving closer and closer together. Yeah? They start moving towards what is called a fixed point. And once they reach that fixed point, the characteristic of that is that once you get to that point, as you keep coarse graining, the system doesn't change. The system becomes what's called scale invariant. So it's a system where even if you blur it, it still looks the same. You blur it again, it still looks the same. So now you've gone from many different systems to this one scale invariant system by coarse graining. And you can figure out certain laws, rules that apply to this coarse-grained system. And it turns out those describe all of those systems as well, because yeah, this coarse-grained system is still those same systems, coarse-grained. So you can study a bunch of different systems that look completely different from each other, as if they were the same system. You're finding some kind of universal behavior underlying a huge number of different systems. And these systems can, in fact, be very different from each other. One of the places where this is famously applied is in noticing some very important similarities between water turning into ice, let's say, and the magnetic behavior of a bar of iron, right? So when you change the magnetic behavior of a bar of iron, these do seem to like two completely different things. Water and magnets are two very different things. And yet, if you take a blurry enough view in a certain sense, you can understand them as the same system, the same description will apply to both of them, right? So there are things that if you look closely enough, if you have enough information about them, these systems just seem completely different from each other. Understanding one seems irrelevant to understanding the other. But coarse graining leads to an insight that actually there is an underlying similarity that unifies the understanding of these things. And that is an important insight into the nature of the world. The idea of what systems being alike at a coarse-grained scale. This is another reason why knowing less can be better. Recognizing similarities between systems that are distinct from the fine-grained perspective. My fourth and final reason why knowing less can be better has to do with causation. We often talk about things causing other things, and this is part of how we understand the world. Understanding the world in terms of causation is part of how we understand the world. In order to get a full grasp of the world, predict how things will happen in the future, and most importantly, intervene in order to change things, we need to have a causal understanding of the world. Here's a very simple system. It's a ball hitting a glass. The glass is shattering. And ordinarily we'd say the ball causes the glass to shatter. But one question we can ask is, can we understand this causal claim from a reductionist perspective? And the answer is actually no. I mean, you can describe maybe all of what is going on here in terms of the behavior of the underlying atoms and so on. But getting the idea of the ball causing the glass to break won't work. Why is this? Because in general, the physical systems we deal with, you can't break them. So here we have a cause and an effect. Now you might hope that I can break up the cause into parts and I can break up the effect into parts and say, okay, this part of the cause is responsible for this part of the effect. This part of the cause is responsible for that part of the effect, and so on. You can sometimes do that, but in general, you cannot do that. Most systems lack a feature which in physics is called integrability. If your system is not integrable, then you can't break down the influence of the cause to and attribute certain parts of the effect to certain parts of the cause. You need to think of the cause collectively and the effect collectively. What's happening when the ball hits the window is not that you can attribute certain parts of the window breaking to certain atoms in the ball. The window breaking is kind of any kind of rigid object fracturing is kind of a phenomenon that can really only be understood causally at a coarse-grained level, because it's a non-integrable system, because you can't break down the cause into parts and attribute and break down the effect into parts and just find, okay, this part caused that part, this part caused that part. That's simply not possible. If you want to describe the system causally, you have to take it as a whole. The ball broke the window, right? But of course, the ball and the window are coarse-grained descriptions of what's going on here, right? Not fine-grained descriptions. So that is the final aspect of why knowing less, having a coarse-grained, blurry view of the world actually gives you, in some sense, a deeper understanding of what's going on. You can identify causal relationships that cannot be identified microscopically. It cannot be identified with a fine-grained view. All right, so here are at least 4 reasons, and there's more as well, but these I think are 4 salient ones, especially from the perspective of trying to understand the world scientifically. We want to be able to predict, we want to be able to have a causal understanding of the world, we want to be able to notice patterns. And many of those things require us to ignore certain aspects of the world in order to access them, right? So it's not just that ignoring them makes it easier to carry out the computations. No, it's that if we weren't ignoring those aspects, then those phenomena, those causal relations simply would not exist in our description of reality. Right? So that earlier view I talked about, where the only advantage of a coarse-grained view is that it makes things simpler, easier to calculate. That misses out on the fact that no, actually seeing important aspects of the world, seeing certain patterns, seeing certain causal relations, requires you to ignore certain information. Just like in the reverse color blindness test, seeing the number requires you to ignore certain, or seeing the word life requires you to ignore certain information. So let me end by addressing 2 potential challenges once I've gone through all of this. That maybe point in the direction of some broader ideas, which I'd be happy to talk about if people are interested. One of these is, okay, it's true that maybe the world could be a certain way where, actually there are these coarse-grained patterns, these coarse-grained structures that cannot be accessed at the fine-grained level. Right? Maybe the world is like a reverse color blindness test. But why is it that way? I mean, if the world was just being put together by random distribution of fine-grained properties, we wouldn't expect there to be any robust or salient coarse-grained patterns in that kind of world. So why does the world as we live in have these robust, impressive coarse-grained regularities that produce all of the structure that we see around us? What is the reason for that, right? Why is it that the world is like a reverse color blindness test, where it seems like this pattern is embedded into it at the coarse-grained level? Yeah.
What do you mean by world?
Well, by world, I just mean the...
Related to science or world?
I mean, my view is that there is ultimately only one world, right? So there's a world that we're trying to study using science. You might also try to study the world using other tools. But ultimately, there is one thing, one reality that we're related to, that we observe, that we live in, that we interact in. It's a shared reality we live in. Science is a description of that world, but that science is not the world. The world is just the objective reality that's out there, right? Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. Okay. The second challenge is Well, why is it? So sure, I've maybe argued that ignoring certain fine-grained details allows you to see these coarse-grained patterns. But you might be thinking that this doesn't really support my initial claim that actually having a less understanding of the world or less access to information about the world gives you a better understanding, because you could say that even someone like Laplace's demon who had a full understanding, they could just choose to ignore certain aspects of what they know. So in some sense, they have all the same abilities that we have. Right? If you have more access to the world, then in some sense, you also have access to those coarse-grained patterns. You just need to ignore certain aspects of what you already know. Right? So in some sense, isn't the argument that actually you should not, that this knowledge would be damaged if you know more about the world, isn't that argument invalid? Right? That knowing more about the world can only give you more information. You can choose to ignore some of that information to see some of the structure, but and so let me try to address both of these. Let me try to address the second one first. Yeah. So let's go back to this example. Now, those of us who are not colorblind, I don't think can will ourselves into seeing the word here. Now, why is that? Well, part of the reason is that this is a visual example, but that's irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make. Part of the reason is that if you don't already know the structure that's in there, you don't know which details to ignore, right? You don't know which parts of your description are noise and which parts are the signal, which parts are actually salient to the pattern you're looking for. So like I said earlier, if you ignore certain details, you see important patterns. But if all I have is I have all these details in front of me, I can't know from that description which ones to ignore and which ones not to ignore. Right? There's nothing in a fine-grained description of the world that tells me if you ignore these details, you'll see a pattern. Right? And so the reason we see these patterns is not because we start out with all the details and then choose to ignore certain things. It's that we have been structured so that we simply do not access that information. We are limited beings due to our biology. We don't have access to full information about the world. And it's precisely that structure that has already pre-selected the information that we'll ignore and allows us to see the structure around us. Yeah. In the absence of that, if we started out as Laplacian demons and then felt like, well, we can figure out for ourselves which details to ignore, how do you do that? Right? And especially when we're talking about cases like physical systems, where there are just unimaginable numbers of possible details you could choose to ignore or not ignore, right? And so the specific selection of what to ignore to actually see the pattern, unless that is something that's already inbuilt into your access to the world, is not something that you can reproduce just by looking at the fine-grained description of the world. Yeah. So let me now finally move to the first question, which is, well, why do these patterns, coarse-grained patterns, exist in the first place? And here, maybe I don't have a fully satisfactory argument, but I do have something that physicists often refer to as an anthropic argument. And an anthropic argument is an argument where you refer to in order to explain why something is observed, you explain it by saying, look, if observers are to exist at all, then they have to exist in an environment where this kind of thing would be observed. So what do I mean by that in this context? Well, all of us, anyone who's interested in the world in general, interested in doing science, interested in doing anything in the world, we're all agents, right? Agents are creatures that access information about the world, use that information to make transformations to the world, to do things. Yeah? And in order for us to be able to exercise that agency, we have to live in a certain kind of environment. Agency is only possible if I can make decisions based on the information I have access to that allow me to predict at least reasonably what the consequences of my action would be. Right? Agency is all about making plans that I'm going to act this way because I predict that this will be the outcome of the action. Yeah? That if I let go of this mic, it's going to fall to the ground. If I kick the table, it's going to fall over. If I kick it hard enough. All of these are predictions that are important for us to be able to exercise even basic agency. Now, but in order for these predictions to be true, it has to be the case that the coarse-grained environment we live in is macroscopically predictable. I don't need to know things at the microscopic level because I don't have the ability to access that information in order to be able to understand the consequences of my interaction with the world. So anything that would reasonably be described as an agent can only evolve in an environment where these coarse-grained patterns and regularities hold. Right. If you're in an environment where there's no interesting coarse-grained structure, then you simply don't have agency, you don't have observers. And another consequence of this is that the cognitive limitations that we as agents have are the lack of ability to be able to understand every detail of the world as we look at it. Those cognitive limitations have to be specifically keyed to the coarse-grained patterns that are relevant to our ability to predict and make decisions, right? That agents can only evolve given any reasonable process of evolution that we understand, so that the sensory limitations that they have are sensory limitations that specifically give them access to the coarse-grained patterns that are necessary for them to make the kinds of predictions that agency requires. So, like I said, we can't voluntarily choose what to ignore. To some degree we can, but in general, on a large scale, we cannot. We have to be equipped to do that already. We have to be built in order to ignore things. And it's very easy, and I think the tradition has been to see that limitation as just that, a limitation. That unfortunately, the world is not as open to us as it would be. We have limited access to the world. We can't see everything. But what I've been trying to argue is that these limitations are precisely those that do open the world to us in very important ways. Right? And this reductionist idea that ultimate knowledge of the world is complete fine-grained knowledge, as much information as you can get. If you want to know about the world at a fine-grained level, then yes, get more fine-grained knowledge. But knowing about the world at the coarse-grained level, in some sense, relies on not having access to that fine-grained knowledge. That is what I've been hoping to argue for. All right, so thank you all for listening. That's okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll get into the question and answer session. Before that, no, I once again make an appeal to become a member of Tamil Nadu Science Forum. And we also want to have your feedback on this lecture. So we have a QR code, just scan the QR code, fill up the couple of questions, provide the feedback that will help us to improve our activities in future. Please fill up the feedback forms, provide the feedback. We have the QR code for that in the table. Become the member of Tamil Nadu Science Forum, become the member of WhatsApp group. You will get communication of our activities. Become the member of Telegram group as well. So let us go to the questions.
Okay. So the session is so insightful. So first of all, so thank you for that. So initially I came and I have some random questions to ask, but after the after the session, I'm completely blown my mind. So I'll start with some couple of questions. You have said the game of life first, the concept, and what I'm believing is the consciousness is a computational. It's not a computational. But I can understand the concept that you explained about the game of life in a way that can I know that how they are imparted the computational the behavior? Is it we are actually trying to learn the nature of behavior in every aspect of the brain and or the physical stimuli like an atom particle, as it how it is it from the historical they are imparting some computational behavior or something we are trying to sorry
Yes. I have the. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think maybe the fact that it's called the game of life maybe suggests that they're presenting life as this kind of competitive endeavor. I mean, and maybe that was part of the intention of Conway. But I think ultimately the way to look at this game of life is not as an attempt to actually model something about reality, right? The idea is not that this is meant as a simplified model of the way actual life works or the brain works or consciousness works or anything like that. So the name of the title, The Game of Life, is a little bit of a misnomer. The idea is just that, or at least for the purposes that I have here, the idea is just that here is a situation where you have simple rules, whether or not those rules correspond to the way the world actually works, and that those simple rules generate behavior of just can generate behavior of amazing complexity, right? And I should reiterate again that the game of life, those simple rules, those 4 rules are Turing complete. So anything that you can do with a computer, right? Like have a model of the environment or run ChatGPT or anything like that, you can just do with those 4 simple rules on that grid, right? Of course, you'd have to have a particular way of interpreting the input and output. But that's the point. Yeah. So I think the idea, the question of why they decided to call it life, particularly, do they have a specifically competitive interpretation of how life works? I don't know the history of why that particular name was chosen. I wouldn't call the dynamics as just competitive, right? There's this idea. I mean, the way Conway frames it is not in terms of, you get outcompeted, so it's like there's this idea of loneliness. If the thing is by itself, then it dies. If it has just the right number of neighbors, it lives. If it has more than those, it dies. So there's some maybe broad analogy with life he's drawing here. But what matters is just the idea of this as a mathematical system, not any modeling of physical systems. I think realistically, it doesn't really model any physical system. So yeah, maybe, yeah, so that's...
Please, Harry. Yeah, we have another meeting.
Okay.
So okay, yeah. So you have mentioned the 4 the causes or the facts that you said this is working on, and you said the last point is causation. And yeah, that is some interesting, because I think Aristotle said the correlation is not a causation. As you said, when we see the reality in a coarse-grained level, and we can only identify as a macroscopic, that you as already said, and we cannot see as a microscopic level. So as we ignore some information, we can also term it as a way we are seeking a confirmational bias. Can I say like that? Because we are seeking one kind of information and we are avoiding a certain information. So is it will become we have cognitive limitations, but is it get into a confirmational bias? So that's my question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, certainly ignoring information as a general strategy can be one way of promoting confirmation bias. But usually confirmation bias is related to ignoring information that you either consciously ignore or you ignore unconsciously, but you're still, in some sense, it's an act of will that you're ignoring it, right? You're ignoring stuff that goes against your view. The limitations I'm talking about here are just like fundamental biological limitations of our cognitive system, right? So in some sense, it's implausible that our kind of higher order values and so on are what I'm influencing, what we're ignoring and what we're not ignoring. That's what happens in a confirmation bias, right? Is that we have certain values, we have certain desires, and those lead us to ignore some information, focus on other information, right? I might ignore information that goes against or seems to refute my values in some sense, and I might be attracted to other information. In this particular case, where we're talking just about the coarse-grained versus fine-grained access to the world, I don't think there's any mechanism by which our desires or values can influence what is being ignored. It's simply the structure of our perceptual system. But more broadly, is there a sense in which this is presenting us with a particularly biased perspective on the world? In a sense, yeah, not like a politically biased or socially biased one, but one that is biased towards the kinds of things that would be of interest to beings of our size and our causal abilities, right? That's not necessarily a negative bias, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Thank you for this lecture. It was fun. Just 2 points immediately. There are a lot of things, interesting things which came up. One is, I think when you talk about our knowing what to ignore, okay, a lot of it also comes through just experience. And so practice has a very important role. So you'll remember this Feyerabend story of the experiments in the Royal Society, where they would do completely random things, okay, with no idea why they are doing it. So knowing what is relevant is something, is something we learn. Or for instance, thinking that people from different racial characteristics are somehow fundamentally different. And then, Pierre Curie examining the heads of people to find out whether the shape of the skull influenced who they were, etc. All of these are examples of where we look for details which we think are relevant, and then we find that they are completely irrelevant. So I think even before the stage where our who we are as human beings would, we have spent a lot of time in the history of science learning through simply practice. So that is one thing which occurs to me. So second thing is, if you remember Gamo's book, 1, 2, 3, Infinity, has all these amusing examples of a different kind of coarse graining, which is to do with the Planck constant. So if the Planck constant were much larger, so a tiger coming through a set of trees in a forest would split into many tigers. So he has very amusing examples like this. But I think so. Other people have speculated that suppose we were beings whose sensory perception was, say, in the X-ray spectrum, not in the visible spectrum. This is the first obvious bias which we have. But eventually, perhaps we have reached a stage so we can kind of reconstruct, like you are doing in your examples, what will X-ray beings, how will they see the world? Not that we can do too much, but perhaps that is so. There is a limitation, but there is also a sense in which, through the way science advances, we are open to perhaps crossing those limitations. Just two thoughts that occurred.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah. So on the first one, I do think that, there's two different ways you can think about ignoring information, right? One is just information that you can't help but ignore because you're constructed in a way that you can't access it. But also, I do agree that part of science and in general, part of our attempt to understand the world is also to figure out what we should consciously ignore. Like we kind of see, okay, are these distinctions relevant to understanding the world? And to a certain extent, that consciously ignoring things can also give us deeper understanding of things. But I guess the point I was stressing here is that is ultimately, the whole process of science is ultimately built on us already being equipped to ignore a whole bunch of things in a way that is useful for us. And then, we can also consciously extend that ability. The second thing, I agree that we can maybe, part of what science can do is that you start from this position, this coarse-grained position, and then you investigate the world. But part of what you're doing when you're investigating the world is trying to transcend your particular coarse-grained perspective on the world, right? Because we're not just interested. Like I said, our coarse-grained perspective is essential to give us access to certain coarse-grained realities. Without having this initial lack of information, we would not have access to these regularities. But of course, as people interested in science, we're not just interested in the coarse-grained world. We also want to understand the fine-grained world. We also maybe want to understand what would the world look like with different coarse-grainings. And so those are certainly different projects that might require us to set aside our limitations and try to transcend them or something like that. So the separate project of certainly Laplace's demon would be very good at understanding the fine-grained structure of the world. If that is what we're interested in, then sure, that would be a perspective we should aspire towards. The claim was just that that is not all we're interested in, or yeah, most of what we're interested in.
I just want to raise one thing here. This is very much similar. What you have been talking is very much similar to what we see in the thermodynamics and statistical mechanics and classical mechanics and quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
The scale is different and the sensitivity of the instruments are different here. So the categories which describe the realities are different. Is that the same thing which you are conveying or different from what?
Well, so I do think some of these lessons are lessons I got from studying statistical mechanics, but I would frame it slightly differently from what you said, that, you know, when we move to a different scale, we need different concepts or we need different instruments. But the argument being made here is that that the most fine-grained scale at which you can describe a system does not carry, and here terminology becomes difficult. I want to say does not carry all of the relevant information about the system. Now, in some technical senses of information, it does, but in our intuitive sense of information, where, you know, it would be information that the word life was written on that thing. The most fine-grained description of a system does not carry that information. Now, even many people who have worked on statistical mechanics have often worked on it from this reductionist perspective, right? The idea would be that we want to reduce statistical mechanical regularities to either kinetic theory or quantum mechanics or classical mechanics or something like this, right? And my argument is that, you know, that reductive project in statistical mechanics is not, I mean, there's a certain extent to which you can understand things like entropy and temperature in terms of the behavior of particles. But that is still not a reduction because you still need that coarse-graining. Yeah. So the idea is that there's actually more information in the coarse-grained description. Yeah, that's, yeah.
But it simply says that is the categories which occurs are much more useful and much more enlightening.
Yeah, and also they're not accessible unless you
just
coarse-grain. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. Yeah, those two things.
We have very because this topic seems to be quite good for me because I'm not. Okay, so do you suggest any book on this coarse-graining?
I don't know if there is any specific book that I know of. I mean, certainly the idea of coarse-graining has been talked about in a variety of different disciplines, right? In statistical mechanics, coarse-graining is an important technique that people use. In all kinds of computational uses that talk about coarse-graining, the renormalization group theory I talked about is something that emerged in quantum field theory. I guess, I mean, there might well be, I'm not kind of hubristic enough to think that nobody else has come up with these ideas before. I'm sure there's people out there who've written these similar ideas up. But I guess I personally have not encountered a book that uses coarse-graining as the fundamental basis to describe what is different between a reductive and emergent viewpoint in the way I've described it, right? So the answer is not really, although there's a number of textbooks on statistical mechanics in general will address this question of coarse-graining as a kind of theoretical technique, and that's where I first started thinking about this. Right?
Did I plan to write book?
I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe a short.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just a minute.
Thank you. It's very interesting. You have taken an abstract subject and make it lively. For me, I would even say for physical systems, it is better to know as fine structure as possible. That is what we have done from Maxwell. We have gone up to Bose-Einstein. We have gone to FD statistics, and they have given us good impact, good advantage for technology. But coming to the human beings, living system, even for trees, even for monkeys, I mean, I try to look at the behavior of trees. It's very difficult to make any prediction. தமிழ் தெரியுமா வேப்ப மரம் ஆலமரம்லாம் பார்த்தா இப்படி தான் வளரும், இது இப்படி வளரும், இப்படி வளரும் பார்த்தா after a certain time they branch out into 2 or 3 or 4. It's rather so at those points grass understanding the features of the grass feature will be very valuable, because even for example cell, if you look at use 1000x ordinary optical microscope, you will have a good understanding.
Yeah.
Beyond 1000, go to 10,000, and that is where you must stop with the cells. If you go down with the electron microscope, you will end up with a total confusion.
Yeah.
You will end up studying a living system. You will end up studying a non-living system. So there is particularly for, in fact, even behavior, mob behavior, statistics, human statistics of living system, this will be a very good starting point. I mean, what I mean by the coarse observation, not the fine structure, coarse observation of a big number of people, maybe this will be very helpful for insurance people. This will be very good for stock market, because nobody understands why it fluctuates, why it goes. I mean, it's still a big issue.
It's a very good point. I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, this is something.
Okay, sorry.
I just wanted to add to that. There is this recent claim that, Hilbert's sixth problem has been solved,
Okay.
which is actually deriving the Navier-Stokes and other fluid dynamics, the macroscopic description from the fundamental motion of atoms. So there's it's a very recent preprint out. So I completely, there's a very interesting point which he made, which I think is related. That's all.
Yeah, I think I also broadly agree, although maybe the one caveat I would say is that I guess the distinction between physical systems and non-physical systems are saying that, we have physical systems that should be understood at the fine-grained level, and then you have systems like crowds or plants or monkeys. At some level, that distinction is a distinction about how we choose to approach a system, right? In some sense, I mean, plants are also physical systems in a sense. It's just that if we choose to approach it as a plant rather than as a collection of atoms arranged in a particular way, that is because we have certain, it has to do more with our purposes, how we choose to describe a system. Right. So for certain purposes, the way I would frame it maybe is, for certain purposes, a fine-grained description is the best description. For other purposes, for other predictive purposes, for other interventional purposes, a coarse-grained description of the same system might be a bit better description, right? Yeah, that's yeah.
You can go ahead and ask. Yeah.
So this concept that less you know, the better, the value of selective ignorance is misleading. So you haven't made it specific that it is in the field of science or something like that. That I want to know.
Yeah. So I do acknowledge that the title is
can't ignore
it's what you might call clickbait in the context of it's right. It's yeah. So
many times, what do you mean by
no. So I certainly don't want to argue, like I mentioned at the beginning. No, I'm saying I don't want to make the argument.
Yeah. So how can you ignore certain things?
Ignore
Gaza, no?
No. Like I'm saying, I don't want to be making the argument that that it's always valuable to ignore as much as we can ignore. That would obviously be a horrible position to be.
So something must
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the title was just meant to be a provocative title. So hopefully the point that I was trying to make became clear. But yeah, you're right. The title should not be taken literally. Yeah.
One should understand that about what you are talking.
Yeah, right.
So it's a science lecture, so people may understand that you are talking about physics or chemistry, but general no one can understand what you are going to. That is, ignorance is bliss is there.
Yeah. Although I will, in partial defense of the title, I will say that it mentions the idea of selective ignorance, right? So the claim there is not you should be as ignorant as possible. It's that being selectively ignorant about certain features yet to be specified, and hopefully the talk specified those features, that helps your knowledge, right? That's
very better effect in political.
In fact, if I may, in defense of the title, also add, for instance, people talk of cognitive dissonance, So you get so much information, or you read so much WhatsApp per day that you really are, you end up being confused. So unless unless you are able to filter out,
Yeah.
okay, there is no understanding. Having a copy of the world
Yeah.
in front of you
Right.
does not produce understanding. So I think even for other things,
Yeah.
even beyond physics, I think selective ignorance
Yeah,
is,
no, I mean, being able to distinguish signal from noise, I think, is a general.
is a very fundamental requirement.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I was.
No, I appreciate the question. Yeah, not at all. Yeah.
So ignore everything. No?
Yeah. No, I fully agree. Yeah. No,
Yeah, hello,
it was.
Father was a professor of inorganic chemistry. The
Okay.
moment I entered, I just
Notice the book. Yeah.
Your organic chemistry, professor of organic chemistry.
Okay, I see. All right.
Yeah, hello, Professor. So, Professor, this is with respect to the last simulation you showed, where you have this ball hitting this piece of glass or something. So you talked about cause and effect, and you made certain statements there. This is with regard. The question is with regard to that. So I'm just trying to say there's a point at which the fine grainness and the coarse grainness split. So consider an experiment, maybe say carbon layers or carbon atom layers, which are like which you can make it in, which you can manufacture in a coarse grain manner. And imagine you have some kind of a 4-point tip or projectile which is hitting it. So that at that exact space, potentially you can predict. So in other words, I'm just arguing for the for this Laplacian demon.
Right.
It's just that since you don't really have the knowledge of the, if you can fabricate multiple copies of this system, let's say 4-layer carbon atom film, and then you hit it with a 4-atom projectile, then you can predict, you can have cause and effect. Why not?
Yeah. So my claim is certainly not that it is that you don't have any cause and effect at this fine grain level at all. So like I said, my argument is that there are different kinds of systems. Some systems are separable in the sense that some coarse-grained systems are separable in the sense that you can attribute parts of the effect to parts of the cause. Other systems don't have that structure. Ones that are separable, you can reduce cause-effect relations to a more fine-grained description. And the particular case you're describing, it seems like the description itself is at a microscopic level, right? The projectile you're thinking of is a microscopic projectile. So there, you almost have to describe the cause-effect relations at a fine-grained level. So I'm not denying that there is cause and effect at the fine-grained level. I'm simply saying that, so there is this view, I think, that reductionists have, that all of the causal action in the world is really happening at the level of fine-grained physics, fundamental physics. And so really any causal claim about the macroscopic world is in some sense going to be reducible to causal claims at the microscopic level. That is the view I'm rejecting. I'm not arguing that some can't be reduced. I'm arguing that all cannot be reduced. Right?
Ignorance is, so-called ignorance is simply the lack of information.
No, in the specific case you're talking about, maybe, yeah, but not in general. In the case of the ball hitting the thing, it's more than so. It's that even a full fine-grained description, a Laplacian view of this, is not going to capture the cause-effect relation that is salient to us, because that is a cause-effect relation that is only capturable at a coarse-grained level. There is the Laplacian demon might be able to give a full law-like account of what happened, right, of the evolution of the system, but distinguishing these two systems, the ball and the glass, and saying that it was the ball colliding with the glass that caused the glass to break, which is how we would naturally want to explain the system, that is not something that you have that can accurately describe what's happening at a fine-grained level. That's a coarse-grained description necessarily. So the point is that it's not just that this is a lack of information, it's that there's certain causal regularities that are purely coarse-grained causal regularities. Not all, but some, where there is no corresponding fine-grained causal regularity. It's not just that we lack knowledge of it, it just doesn't exist. That's the claim. Yeah.
I'm just saying, for a question to ask, the distinction between fine-grained and coarse-grained will break down.
No, there's certainly examples. So yeah, I don't want to claim that this is so. So the example you gave is one where you would need the fine-grained example. But I mean, what I'm arguing is that you can't generalize from that to say that that is a general fact. That because we can have a fine-grained causal account in this case, we can have it in every case. I think the case I described is one where you cannot have it. Yeah, that's the.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot for coming. Yeah, appreciate your questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for this lecture. Actually, I belong to humanities, so I don't know whether to ask this question or not. Is it possible to apply these principles to humanities, social sciences, social system to understand? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I'm a philosopher, so I also belong to the humanities. So we're both united in that respect. Yeah, I mean, if the argument is that can we have similar arguments in social science or psychology about how ignoring certain things can lead to knowledge, it's certainly true for social systems that people have worked on this. I think the example was mentioned about like crowd behavior or behavior of collective groups, but that is more social science. Humanities specifically, I mean, maybe you can make an argument that, how you describe history or generalizations you make in history and so on are hinged crucially on what aspects of the description of what happened you consider relevant and what you don't consider relevant. This is something in general that, for example, historians are aware of, right? That it's not enough to just collect data on what happened in the past. There's a kind of selectivity involved there. Is that similar to what I'm talking about? Not strictly speaking, but I mean, there's a similar principle at play there, right? That there's some kind of selectivity aids in a full understanding of what is happening, right? Yeah.
I want to ask if in this day and age there is I'm just asking a general question. There is so much of algorithm, doodle ads, so marketing, so many information is there, so many newspapers, so many apps, so many channels, etc., etc. It is a excessive information age. It is maybe. So how to ignore? Maybe it is a general reason not related to science. Maybe this question can be drawn parallels to the science also.
Yeah, I mean, I will have to some extent plead ignorance on this question. That I certainly see the point you're making is that, yeah, there is some way we have to deal with information overload. I think TJ was making the same point earlier. There's some kind of filtering mechanism we need when we access information.
If we filter also, there's so many notifications. Yeah. We need some apps so that
Yeah, but the question about what the best way to do that is, I'm not going to pretend that I have any special insight into that. This is a question on which people with very different expertise from me have worked on for a long time. I would want to usurp their claim to expertise. But I guess I acknowledge the problem that you're talking about, and I think it's something that I'm sure people have thought about and is both thinking that needs to be done, but it's not something I personally feel like I have anything very insightful to say about how exactly you go about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So,
just a quick, one of the things that struck me was the parallel between the top-down view and the bottom-up view, the emergent versus the reductionist, and the coarse-grained versus the fine-grained. I'm drawing a broad parallel, as you can see. Is there some subtlety that I'm missing?
No, in some sense. So the question of the emergent versus the reductionist. So one, I mean, the kind of motivation for this project partially is to demystify the conception of emergence, because it's a conception that is used quite a lot by philosophers and scientists. And usually the idea is that if you want to avoid a claim that something can be reduced, you call it emergent, right? And so what I'm trying to do is say, okay, what exactly does this mean? Because emergence involves this curious dichotomy of, on the one hand, autonomy of the higher level from the lower level, but on the other hand, you still acknowledge some kind of dependence of the higher level or the lower level, right? Someone who argues for emergence is not simply saying there's some brand new property in the world, like a soul or something. It's still somehow physics going on, but it is autonomous from fundamental physics. And so part of what I've tried to do here is to make sense of how you reconcile autonomy and dependence in that sense. And the argument here is that you don't need some extra element being added in to the physical description of the world. In fact, what you need is to take away part of the physical description of the world. And that gives you, in some sense, autonomy. That gives you novel causal properties, that gives you regularities at a different scale. So this is, in some sense, an attempt to articulate how we should be thinking about emergence. That's the idea here.
Yeah. We have. So the first time the viewers from YouTube has outnumbered the people sitting here. So we have a lot of questions in YouTube. Apart from that, a couple of questions which has come up through my WhatsApp as well. Let me read the questions one by one. The first question is, can prejudice be seen as a form of selective perception? If so, how does this mechanism provide survival advantage and what are the potential drawbacks?
Certainly, prejudice can be seen as, I mean, at least some aspects of prejudice, I guess, could be selective perception. I don't know if prejudice in general is just reducible to selective perspective. In fact, sometimes prejudice is the opposite, I think. It's about drawing distinctions that should not be drawn rather than ignoring distinctions that actually exist. Right? In general, I think that's how you would think about prejudice. So coarse-graining is about ignoring distinctions that exist. Prejudice in general is about drawing distinctions that are really irrelevant or maybe should not be drawn. So in that sense, while I can imagine that selective perception in general, you might perceive something someone in your in-group does as virtuous, the same thing you perceive someone in your out-group doing as vicious. That kind of selective perception, sure. But the kind I'm talking about, which is about ignoring certain distinctions, I'm not sure if that is the same thing as prejudice. So
I don't know that.
I don't see the connection.
What intention?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. The way of taking that question is that could this go astray in a way that is pretend? Okay, we have to wind up soon. Next, last question.
Thank you. Thank you for that insightful lecture. Supposing a system is being studied and I have n different individuals trying to study the coarse-grained structure of the system because understanding the fine-grained structure study is difficult. Then I have n different perspective of the coarse-grained structure. So I have n different results. So is it enough if I study the n different results of the coarse-grained structure to understand the fine-grained system, or I still have to understand the fine-grained system?
If you want a fine, so I guess it depends on your purposes. If your purpose is to understand the fine-grained structure of the system, then yeah, having different coarse-grained descriptions is not going to give you full access to the fine-grained structure because every coarse-grained description leaves out some information. Now, potentially there might be n different coarse-grainings that were perfectly arranged so that whatever information is left out of one is not left out of the other, is present in the other. And so in some sense, they each make up for each other's informational deficits. Right. In which case, yeah, having the collection of those would let you infer the fine-grained structure. But in general, that's not going to be the case. If n people are studying, usually the coarse-grainings will be more or less similar. They won't be making up for each other's defects. Right?
Yeah. So therefore, instead of studying the n, then I have to depend on the Laplacian domain to understand the fine-grained.
If you want to understand the fine-grained structure, sure. If you want to do fundamental physics, then yes, we need to look at the fine-grained structure. My argument is just that when you want to do all kinds of other things, we don't need to look at fundamental physics, despite what Weinberg and Crick and so on was saying. Right?
Yeah, right. So then how do I know the exact nature of the system?
I think part of the point is that what you mean by the exact nature of the system depends partially on your purposes, right? Right? Like the reverse color blindness test I gave. What is the exact nature of that system? Does it have the word life written on it or not? Right. On one hand, you might say if the word is only visible to people who are colorblind, then really that's not part of the actual nature of the system or something like that. Right. But I think that the idea that the system has one actual nature that we're all trying to capture, I think that is maybe a misleading way of thinking about it. It's like we have different purposes for which we engage with systems in the world around us. And for some of those purposes, a coarse-grained view is much more productive than a fine-grained view. For some of them, a fine-grained view is more productive. Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
So it's a time for a vote of thanks and
Okay, thank you all. Yeah, for your question.
so we are. Yeah, let me thanks Professor Tarun. So I just sent an email a couple of months back, and he says that no, May 3rd. So it was decided on January itself, and because he was very busy with his academic activities, and he gave a time, and he traveled on his own on the way from Bangalore to Chennai, and he gave a wonderful talk. It is. Thank you very much, Tarun. And I also thank the library authorities for providing us continuously. It's without the Anna Central Library patronage, we would not have conducted 90 lectures. Every month we are conducting lectures. I'm thankful to the ACL authorities and ACL staff, particularly Dr. Sivavarmal, and so many people are helping us, and we are conducting this. And my thanks goes to the all audience who patiently sit here and involved in the discussion lively. I thank you all. And we have 75 audience sitting in the YouTube and 10 audience in the Zoom. So totally 87 who are not away, who